This occurred a few years ago, just before the end of the school year. It was the last day of 8th grade, and it was exactly like any other middle school final day. Everyone was running around signing and writing corny notes in each other's yearbooks. Because my middle school had a lot of students, almost 1,000, the teachers gathered our yearbooks and distributed them among the classrooms to keep things under control. I'm sure you could see how that could lead to issues, as anyone who wanted to could write anything in anyone's yearbook. The teachers did their best to keep things from getting out of control, but I knew a few students who wrote nasty messages to people they didn't like. When I received my yearbook back, I eagerly read through all of the silly notes from my friends. However, as I was scanning the pages, I noticed a signature beneath the face of a person I had never seen before. His name was Samuel Robinson III, and I will remember him for the rest of my life. His message was brief, straightforward, and honestly a little unnerving. "Hags, I'll be seeing you again." I stared at the page in confusion, realizing that I had never spoken to this Samuel kid. There was nothing I could do about it, though, because the school year was over, so I couldn't see him even if I wanted to. I simply chalked it up to some strange kid being weird or perhaps an honest error. Before I knew it, I was at home throwing a sleepover in my basement with my best friends Kevin, David, and Kieran. The four of us played Call of Duty and ate Doritos all night long. Since my parents' bedroom was 3 floors above us, we didn't have to worry about making noise. We were playing with my dad's rowing machine just before 2 o'clock when we heard a loud knock on the storm door. The sound instantly silenced us. It didn't make sense. The knocking continued in the same rhythmic pattern, and I could tell Kieran was about to say something, but I couldn't stop him in time. He asked in a loud and assertive voice, "Who was there?" I wanted to knock him out. I told whoever was out there that we were down there. Since my basement has no external windows, it was unlikely that they had known, but now they did. After a long silence and no more knocking, a muffled voice answered, saying, "Come around to the back door." His high-pitched voice sounded genuinely happy, like he was a friend of ours trying to join the sleepover. It was definitely a teenager's voice, and it didn't sound like someone pretending to raise their voice either. I was pretty scared, I can't lie, but my friends seemed unfazed, as if they found it exciting that some random kid was outside my house. They insisted that I at least check it out, and even though I didn't want to, they coerced me into it. We crept upstairs, being careful not to make too much noise. I walked slowly toward the back door, trying to ignore the pounding in my chest, and through the narrow glass pane next to it, I saw a shadowy figure standing in the dim light. My jaw almost dropped when I realized who it was. That kid Samuel Robinson III, who had signed my yearbook. My friends went to open the door for some reason, but I stopped them, telling them I knew who it was, and that made them feel a little better. Remember that Sam was still outside during our conversation, and he could definitely see us, so he must have noticed how alarmed I was because he began gesturing to the side of the house as if he wanted me to go to the window. More seriously, I believe it was because it wasn't like an older stranger was harassing us. Rather, it was a kid from our own school. I went to my kitchen window and slightly cracked it open, and my friends followed me. I asked him what he wanted, telling him that I recognized him from our yearbook, and he said, "Oh, so you got my message." He then introduced himself as Sam, and he continued by saying that he always watched me from a distance and that we could have been good friends. I agreed with him just to avoid upsetting him, but there was no chance that I would have been friends with this kid under any circumstances. I didn't want to press him too soon, but I had to know, so I asked. Before I could defuse the situation, David called him a creepy stalker and told him to piss off. Sam's smile vanished, and he tilted his head as if he didn't understand what David had just said. Then, in an instant, his expression changed from being passive and honestly kind of friendly to aggressive and angry, and he began screaming things at me, including how he hated my friends and thought we should all die, how my ex hated me, and other things he had no business knowing. He reached for the window and attempted to force it open, but I jammed it shut and locked it. He began snarling at the window, banging on it like an animal, and was 2 seconds away from breaking it. Sam fled when my parents rushed down the stairs, demanding to know why we had woken them up. I told them as quickly as I could, and my dad ran outside in his underwear. When he returned a few minutes later, he said he had no idea where the child had gone, and they would deal with the school the next morning to give the child the benefit of the doubt. The following morning, they called the school, and that's when we found out the disturbing truth. Sam had been expelled a few weeks before the end of the year, and he shouldn't have ever been there on the last day. Apparently, the yearbooks were printed before his expulsion, which is why his picture was still there, meaning he had sneaked into the school. The whole thing was a pretty big deal, but the school did everything they could to keep things under wraps. To this day, I still don't know how he knew where I lived, and that's what freaks me out the most. The prevailing theory is that he was a mentally challenged and troubled young boy who took a strange liking to me for whatever reason, and then he stalked me for who knows how long. My parents were worried for weeks about it because it's just uncomfortable, but living in the same house has never felt the same since. My friend Garrett is a little unhinged, and when I say a little, I mean a lot. Boasting about how crazy and aggressive he is, as if it's cool or something, and spending more time in the gym than anywhere else, including his own house. There are actually 5 stories about him that I could choose to share, but the most terrifying is the one you're about to hear. It also directly involves me, and I feel much more comfortable sharing my own story than someone else's. This happened a few weeks ago, which also happened to be the last day of senior year in May 2019. The graduation ceremony wasn't scheduled for a few days, so even though we were finished, we still had to stay. It's customary for all graduating seniors to get plastered on the last day of classes, so that's exactly what we did. It was bittersweet for me at least, but I think everyone was relieved to have finished finals, which are pretty tough at my school. There are a few other senior traditions I could tell you about, but I'm going to try to keep things brief. There were 6 of us. It was me, CTRN, and obviously Garrett. I don't think the rest of my friends would be comfortable with their names out there, so I'm just calling them by their initials. I should also quickly mention that we lived off campus, so we had to walk through the city to get home. There are a fair number of homeless people in that. We were returning home from the clock tower when Garrett did some Garrett stuff. It wasn't really his fault, but that's neither here nor there. Normally, homeless people in this area keep to themselves because they're all high on drugs and don't notice their surroundings, but this guy obviously wanted to engage. He was just standing in the middle of the crosswalk, yelling things at us like he was a bridge troll guarding the other side of the street. We laughed a little and began to move in a wide semicircle around him so as not to annoy or aggravate him. The guy told him to stop harassing strangers and to get the F out of the street. The tweaker took some aggressive steps toward him, so the rest of us jumped in to stop an altercation. We must have intimidated the tweaker because he stopped charging and resumed just yelling things. I pulled Garrett out of the street and tried to get him to behave, but he pushed my hand away before any of us could do anything. The tweaker started running away, which made Garrett stop charging and begin laughing. I know it's bad, but the scene was genuinely funny as messed up as it was. It was like running full speed into a flock of birds and watching them scatter. After a few minutes, we started walking towards our house, but we realized that we were about to graduate from a very prestigious university and had been celebrating all night with alcohol, so we weren't in the right frame of mind to properly evaluate the situation. Look, I'm not proud of everything that happened that night, but we were about to graduate and had been drinking all night, so we weren't in the right frame of mind to properly evaluate the situation. About a block away from our house, we realized the guy was still following, albeit a little further back. I told the other guys that I didn't feel comfortable leading him to our house, and he responded by yelling that we had made a big mistake and that he was going to quote a niche whatever that meant. I won't even go into what we did back at the house. Let's just say it was a level of degeneracy I won't be approaching anytime soon. I was stumbling out the front door to pick up my DoorDash when I noticed something strange. The side gate that led into our backyard was wide open, which was especially strange because we used this little strand of twine to keep it shut. He started running at the guy again before the group could reach a consensus, and Garrett turned and jogged back towards us. We assumed that was it. I put the DoorDash on the porch and tried to walk straight as I turned the corner into the backyard. Before I could even see it, I felt a rope around my throat, and I flailed around wildly, but it was to no avail. Someone was strangling me from behind, and I felt the frayed ends of the rope digging into my throat as he tightened it with all his strength. I honestly thought I was going to die. With all my might, I swung my legs backward and he lost his footing. The two of us hit the ground and I could breathe again, but he was still on top of me. I'll try to keep things brief from now on. I had to go to the hospital that night because I could feel blood running down my cheeks. The cuts weren't too bad, but I needed a lot of shots to protect me from any diseases the guy might have had. The police weren't very helpful, and since I was moving out a week later, there wasn't much I could do either. The worst part of the whole situation was that I had visible cuts in all of my graduation pictures. Garrett felt terrible, so he ended up taking me to New, but I never held anything against him. I just hope he's learned his lesson about not upsetting people who have nothing to lose. When I was in 7th grade, there was this kid named Sven in my homeroom. To put it mildly, he was a bit strange. I didn't have all of my classes with him, but from what I remember, he would always sit in the same spot in every room, the back corner opposite the door. He didn't talk much, of course, but when he had to read a passage or answer a question, he had a really deep voice that many other kids made fun of. I don't remember him having any friends at all, which made sense. One day, during recess, my friend Tyler caught him slicing worms, for which I'm fairly certain he ended up receiving detention. Speaking of recess, Sven would spend the entire period alone next to the fence that surrounded the woods. He never played any games or did anything even. I'm trying to think of other things about him that are worth mentioning because I've never seen him doing anything remotely kid-centric. Some of my friends said they saw him talking to someone on the other side of the fence, but I've never seen that myself. He had a few peculiarities and other strange habits that are typical of any strange middle schooler, but they have nothing to do with the story I'm going to tell. This happened on the last day of school. I went to a fairly large middle school with many students per grade, so there were a lot of concurrent classes with students from the same year going on all the time. As a result, there was a tradition on the last day of school where students from the same year would sneak into and sit in random classrooms to try to tamper with the teachers. I'm fairly certain that. I can't recall exactly when this happened, but I do recall that I was in one of the few classes I shared with Sven. Everything was exactly as it had been all day, and the entire class was mixed up with random students who should have been somewhere else. I was raised as a strict stickler for rules, so I never took part in any of the tomfooling, but my friends all did, so I was frequently alone in all of my classes because they went to other rooms together. This was one of those occasions when all of my friends had left the room, and the only child I knew, coincidentally, was Sven. Sven was acting strange that day, and I can't quite recall what we were doing in class, but I do recall that Sven was tapping his foot rather aggressively, which he never did. He was also constantly looking around the room as if he was trying to find someone or keep track of someone, but I couldn't be sure. The other thing I remember is that there were a lot more students in the class that I didn't recognize. Granted, 1 or 2 weren't unusual because everything was switched around, but the likelihood that there were so many students I had never seen before was slim. At one point, the teacher, I believe her name was Miss Bell, told us to divide into groups of 3 or 4 to complete some sort of end-of-year reflection worksheet. Nothing serious, most kids just used it as an excuse to chat and play. At one point, Miss Bell approached her desk and picked up the classroom phone and turned her back on us. A few minutes later, another teacher arrived, I believe from the room next door. They stepped just outside the classroom door and began whispering. It was only a brief conversation, maybe 30 seconds, but something about it felt strange, like they were trying not to make a scene. Miss Bell looked uncomfortable, and that's really the best way I can describe her behavior. When they were done, Miss Bell and the other teacher returned to the room. They didn't say anything to the class. Instead, they simply walked over to a few particular students and knelt down next to their desks. I couldn't hear what they were saying, but whatever, it was quiet, obviously not wanting the rest of us to notice. A minute later, those same students got up and followed the teachers into. Miss Bell returned a few minutes later alone, and I felt like I was the only one who even noticed what was happening. She didn't say anything about the kids who had left, but she just sat back down at her desk and began shuffling papers as if nothing had happened. However, immediately after she did, the fire alarm went off, and Miss Bell didn't really react as if she knew it was going to happen. She told us to line up and head outside, and we joined the rest of the school out by the field behind the building. As usual, everyone was grouped by homeroom, so I found myself standing there with a number of familiar faces, but I looked back at the school for no apparent reason, just out of habit, and I thought I saw something move in one of the second-story windows. It was brief, And perhaps it was just a reflection or a shadow or something, but it felt wrong. The school was supposed to be completely empty, so I kept it to myself, but I was really afraid when it came to going back inside. We never went back inside, but before the alarm even stopped ringing, we heard sirens. A few minutes later, police cars began to pull into the lot. Not just one or two, but a line of them. Officers didn't waste time either, they just jumped out and rushed straight into the building. Teachers told us to remain calm and wait. After a while, someone came around and announced that school was being let out early. We were never told what actually happened, but my parents eventually told me what had happened, or at least what the school had told them. The details are still a little hazy, so I'm hoping I'm explaining everything correctly, but the part that really stuck with me was when my mom said at the end that the kids had been led in by Sven through the side fence during recess. The whole thing was so strange that it's still hard to process, and I never saw Sven again. There was a rumor that they were planning to set the place on fire. Apparently, Miss Bell had found some extremely concerning tools in one of the children's backpacks, and the school attempted to flush everyone out with the fire drill.